Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for virtual Bulldogs Behind the Scenes, featuring an overview of the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. We're going to be talking about tribal sovereignty and understanding tree harvest in the modern era. Before we begin, we are going to take a moment here to pause so that everyone has a chance to log on. While we wait, feel free to type your name, grad year if you're an alum of UMD, and where you are tuning in from in the chat box, and we'll begin in just a moment. Well, my name is Molly Clevin, and I'm from the University of Minnesota Duluth Alumni Relations team, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, I'd like to highlight some of our past programs. We have explored places like the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, Amsoil Arena, Superior Hiking Trail, the proposed UMD Sales Center, the Chocolate Lab, Romano Gym, and many more places. You can access all of these events on demand at our website, d.umn.edu/alumni. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our Alumni Relations website. You will receive an email with the link once that is ready. Finally, we'll have time at the end of the presentation to answer some live questions. To submit a question, use the question and answer button on the bottom of your screen. Now to introduce our guest. Today, we will hear from Jenny Van Sickle. Jenny is the Public Outreach Specialist for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. She is Tlingit Athabaskan and was raised in Sitka, Alaska. She graduated from the University of Maine, Augusta with an associate's degree in mental health and human services, and later earned her bachelor's degree in social work from the University of Wisconsin Superior. Please join me in welcoming Jenny.
Well, thank you, Molly, and thank you everybody for being here today. Thanks to everybody at the UMD Bulldogs Alumni Relations Office, and of course, the American Indian Studies Program for helping organize this today. Like you said, I am Jenny Van Sickle, and I am Tlingit Athabaskan Shitkaquan, and the other way that I traditionally introduce myself is Wase Iati Hatyake, Tlingit Kagunana Ayachet Yech Keksari Nach Gagenhit Shitkaquan. And all of that tells you where I'm from and where my family's from. I was born and raised in Sitka, Alaska, where the Tlingit people have called their homelands for over 10,000 years. I am a Raven moiety, and in Tlingit culture, the Raven moiety is divided up into crests and houses and clans. But you don't need to know all that for today. There will be no quiz at the end. And, you know, I don't want anybody to feel like you have to be an expert in federal Indian law when we leave here today. We'll go slow and we'll just cover the basics on a little bit about what we do at GLIFWC and get to know each other a bit. And yeah, we'll have questions and Q&A at the end. So looking forward to that piece. Here you'll see the a traditional totem. The frog and the raven are always featured together as a foundational pair in Tlingit culture. And this design here is by David Boxley. And in the Tlingit culture, we have a birthright to all of these animal depictions, but artists, of course, have rights to their images. So I just want to show you this map very quickly as a way to challenge something that you have seen a million times in your life. The Aleutian chain and the Panhandle and the North Dakota, all the way down to Georgia and beyond. We always knew that Alaska was this large, and was large enough to contain Texas, California, and Montana combined. But I think the way you typically see Alaska depicted is somewhere down in the corner, or maybe not even on the map, or maybe somewhere near Hawaii. So I just show you this briefly to challenge your perspective on the way you see your own homelands depicted typically. A lot of times when I'm asked to give these presentations, sometimes there is an invitation that sounds something like, we don't have a lot of tribal exposure. And I think what folks sometimes mean is that we don't have a lot of positive cultural exposure. So we won't get into this. There are entire college courses on Native American culture depicted in mass media. So I just like to say, I think there is a lot of exposure, but the zeitgeist is, of course, shifting. And there's so much content, of course, podcasts and TikTok and the Oregon Trail for millennials like me have been recreated and remastered with Indigenous voices. The mainstream has really shifted, and the culture is being broadcast from Indigenous perspectives. So the future is bright. So GLIFWC, that stands for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, like Molly mentioned. We were formed in 1984 through a series of court cases and Indigenous resistance to oppression. But all of our work is really centered around the sacred and scientific conservation and protection of natural resources. And I show you this honeycomb just to illustrate how GLIFWC is sort of structured. And on the far right, you'll see tribal nations. And GLIFWC works with 11 tribal nations across what is now 3 states and 4 treaties. Tribal nations are sovereign, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the commission itself has a couple of arms. So you'll see we have a board of commissioners. Every nation has a seat on that board of commissioners. That's 11 seats. And then there are 2 subcommittees, the Voight Task Force and the Lakes Committee. And the Voight Task Force is, our member tribes that largely deal with inland harvesting, and the Lakes Committee is largely our membership that is, on the Big Lake, Gitchigami. And then there's GLIFWC staff, where 5 divisions largely working together on the same mission to support our member tribes. And I point this out because, GLIFWC doesn't tell anybody what to do. GLIFWC is not a paternalistic organization where anybody's answering to us. We don't do for tribes. We don't tell tribes. We're there to help. We are there to help with the impressive capacity that tribes already have. And we are there to support that management. And we act as liaisons sometimes with the state or other partners as well. So I just always want to be really clear that, sometimes there's this misunderstanding that contacting GLIFWC is the same as contacting the tribes, and that's just not necessarily the case. We can help facilitate that sometimes, but always best to defer to your local community, your Indigenous leaders, and, they might reach out to us to see how we can support the work that you're proposing. This is a map you'll see a lot when working with GLIFWC. This is a list too of our membership tribes. You can see the treaties here from 1836 all the way over to 1854. You'll notice the small squares in there. Those are reservations. And, sometimes people misunderstand the size of reservations. Sometimes there's this narrative that they are expansive and, Here it really shows you in context how small those parcels are. Also remembering that reservations were invented by the federal government. So when we're talking about treaty harvest, I want you just to remember this map in a way that when in the Treaty of Washington is signed in 1836, or the Mineral Treaty in 1842 down to 37 and up to 54, harvesting was not sequestered to these reservations. It was across the ceded territory. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But when we're talking about off-reservation treaty harvest, we're talking about all of this land filled in with the purple, green, and orange. That is the land that was retained, that is still intact. Sometimes people say, no, this is what it used to look like. No. This is what it looks like right now. So this is essentially the purview of GLIFWC's reach. This is a quick look at how we're structured internally. So we have a biological services division where scientists and indigenous knowledge holders work together around whether it's manumin restoration, wild rice restoration, understanding things in forestry like the emerald ash borer, or everything from understanding the work between the state and wolf harvest in protections, in how those plans come to materialize. Waterfowl, there's a lot that happens in biological services. Enforcement, again, this is all off reservation. Tribes have their own capacity, their own sovereignty to self-rule on their reservations. So our wardens work with a lot of youth. They do a lot of education around understanding safety and hunter safety classes, and different winter camps and things like that, and supporting again a lot of work down at the boat landings and out in the field. Our admin department does a lot of work around helping folks get certified in food handling. They do really incredible language initiatives, particularly for kids. Then we've got our attorneys. These are the super smart kids, right, that do a lot of environmental policy, for example. We get a lot of questions about different projects, around mining or pipelines. A lot of those questions go to the policy professionals here in governmental affairs. And then there's my office, the public information division, where we do a lot of presentations. We spend a lot of time in schools and on campuses, state fairs, just trying to build that awareness, education, and outreach, and seeing how we can support teachers in the classrooms or different professional organizations that are curious but not quite sure how to build that confidence to teach some of these concepts in school. This is another look at the map. So again, these treaties are current. This is a current map of ceded territory. And I don't want to confuse the term ceded territory with an understanding that these were friendly, mutual agreements, but these are the treaty boundaries in force that have been affirmed again and again by the highest courts and everywhere in between. You can see that they stretch out into the water. That's an important distinction. Again, you'll see these reservations here as well. So you'll see just the contrast here when these treaties are signed, and about 100 years go by where treaty harvest is, off-reservation treaty harvest is criminalized, and harvest is confiscated. Boats are confiscated because over the top of these treaties, within a couple of years of these treaties being signed, all of these territories then gain statehood. I also want to point out that the term treaty, it just means it's a nation to nation contract. So the other thing you might notice here is the timeline here pretty clearly depicts Western expansion. UMD, of course, is in the Treaty of 1854 in that ceded territory, and that is Fond du Lac's reservation down in the bottom portion of that. So all of these territories gain statehood after this land is ceded. And on top of this treaty territory, they create state lines, they create state governments, they create state agencies that have missions around conservation and, land and water management that is happening on top of and next to these sovereign nations that the US recognized. And I think another way to really talk about sovereignty is if somebody said, I am going to gift you your internal monologue. I'm going to give you the ability to think for yourself. I'm going to give you the ability to think for yourself, to act on behalf of yourself and your family, your community. I think that would be really confusing because that's not something you can give somebody. But more importantly, it's not something you can take away. There might be things that you can do to suppress that action. There might be things that you could do to discourage that kind of advocacy or self-governance, but you could never give somebody the ability to think for themselves, to act or self-rule, and you could never take that away. So that's something to consider around sovereignty, is the inherent right to self-rule. And as the United States is moving west, as it's expanding, it recognized that in 1836 as it encountered these Ojibwe nations. There are hundreds of treaties across the United States. There are hundreds of reservations across the United States. Again, this is just the purview of GLIFWC and our member tribes. And also to remember treaty, again, that it's a nation-to-nation contract, and it's not exclusive to Ojibwe nations or tribal nations. There's, of course, the Treaty of Versailles. There's the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolution War. So it's not exclusive to nation-to-nation contracts with Native Americans, but it's something that the United States has done long before treaties were being signed. And if it helps to say, agreement or deal, it's in the same context. They have the same force of federal statute, and violating a treaty is the same as violating federal law. So remember your civics class, right? So you have local government, municipal government, county government, state government, and then federal government. And that is where the treaties fall up there. So after these are signed, 100 years of oppression, again, criminalizations go by. And in 1965, William Boise Jandreau. If you don't know who William Boise Jandreau is, but you know who Lewis and Clark is, or Manifest Destiny, or the Louisiana Purchase, your education might have been colonized. But he, of course, is a revered leader in the Upper Peninsula. And, I don't, again, I don't want to say mounted a resistance, but appealed his citation for his off-reservation treaty harvest. And that happens again in 1972 with the Gurno decision, and again in 1974. Again, this is across ceded territory across those 3 states. You'll notice the treaties, again, overlap because the state lines did not exist. So as Ojibwe people retained in those treaties the right to be Ojibwe and hunt, fish, and gather across those ceded territories, they're denied that for a long time. So as these citations are being issued, tribal members really start fighting back and appealing and taking it to the courts, and they start winning. They win based on the language in those treaties. So when we talk about retained, treaties didn't give Native American rights. They already had them. They already had the right to be Ojibwe and live on the land. So keeping that in mind, these appeals go all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And the deciding vote in the 1999 Mille Lacs case was Sandra Day O'Connor, who had a relationship with Northern Wisconsin and really understood how things were in this part of the country and the relationship tribes had, and the rights that they had retained. So this has been affirmed again and again and again. Exercising those rights is where we start to see, harassment and protest down at the boat landings in the 80s and the 90s, where we really start to see tribes exercising those rights and the pushback through misinformation of the public. This is a video we don't have time to watch, but I will just say that if you visit our YouTube page, GLIFWC has many videos. That was from our Ogechida series, which means warrior. The Tribble brothers are still alive, and they talk about being cited. They talk about, years and years of this moving through the courts, and they are lovely and just have a really nice sense of humor and perspective on their work. So if you get a chance, check it out. These are a couple of our scientists, Mark Loring and Butch, and they are participating in an annual assessment of walleye populations. So again, in partnership with state agencies and tribes, our work is studying the populations, understanding those populations, and giving recommendations around harvest. And, in the springtime, there's always some discussion about spearing and, making sure that people understand how highly regulated these types of harvests are. Tribal spearers must get daily permits. There are, limits. Everything is measured and sexed, and, it's rigorous. And, we work really hard to make sure that we support those efforts tribally and at the state level to make sure that everybody understands how hard we're working. And, sometimes you'll hear that, Native people can just do and take whatever they want. And that's, of course, not even close to the case. There's a lot of work and a lot of education to make sure that these resources are protected, not only now, but with the view that they would be protected for 7 generations. We hold a lot of events throughout the year. In the bottom right, you'll see one of our wardens giving boater safety to tribal kiddos from the grades 5 through 8. We publish a lot of original materials. We have the Tommy Sky series, which follows, a middle school age Ojibwe kiddo in the modern era, learning about his culture, teaching about his culture, in just a really fun, relatable way. Every summer, we host a healing circle walk that connects 10 Ojibwe communities across ceded territory. And in case you're starting to miss winter, I wanted to include a winter photo here. This website that we are just launching now does a really good job of taking Ojibwe language into classrooms where everybody might not be super comfortable, but this, does a lot of pronunciation, fun photos, and teachings and learnings about these four-leggeds and their significance to Ojibwe culture. And, it'll go right through the book, flip the page, and all of that good stuff, just to keep it fun and make sure, again, that the learning we do across ceded territory is authentic and it's reliable. We have, an active Facebook presence, and again, YouTube, if you get a second. They're all digestible, about 5 minutes, so nothing too rigorous in that sense. And with that, I just want to say, thanks for having me on today. And in Ojibwe, we always say thank you, miigwech, and in Tlingit, we say gunakchish to say thank you. So with that, I just want to pause to make sure that we have time for questions.
Oh, perfect, Jenny. Thank you so much for sharing with us about GLIFWC and providing that perspective and understanding on treaty harvest. As you mentioned, we're going to transition to our Q&A. So I'm actually going to have you exit out of your screen, Jenny, and we will flip our cameras on here.
You got it.
Perfect. And so again, as a reminder, if you would like to submit a question, the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen is the place to do that. So I think we will kick it off. This question is kind of a two-parter. How do DNR regulations and tribal treaty rights differ?
That's a good question. I think one of the main differences and points to differ there is the methodology in which each regulation is created. So GLIFWC's work is all through Indigenous teachings. It's, again, like you see our scientists out on the water, but everything we do is derived first from Indigenous expertise. And what we're starting to see in the more Western discipline understanding of regulations and biocontrols is they're really starting to speak on Western science catching up with Indigenous knowledge. And you'll see a lot of Indigenous knowledge holders say, we've been trying to tell you this entire time. So I think that's one method that really differs in those regulations. I think the other is the amount. Commercial fisheries and tribal harvest are very different in the numbers that are harvested, and methodology is different. So those are a couple of main differences.
And so the second part to the question, how does this affect tribal members and public hunters and fishers?
So like we talked, the treaties are creation of higher order. So they're state and then federal and treaty. Sometimes there is non-enforcement of DNR rules and regulations. For example, there are laws around no wake zones in fragile environments. And when those are not enforced at the state level or at the DNR level, that can be disastrous for wild rice recovery. Not following those rules can be very challenging when you have, we're all connected. You can't say this body of water and that body of water, all of it's connected. So over harvesting anywhere or invasive species, zebra mussels, lake shores where you see pollution, all of that impacts tribal hunters. And if I didn't answer that correctly, please follow up if it feels like I didn't quite hit that point.
We have some live questions coming in right now. The first one asks, has the current leaning right Supreme Court affected the current state of affairs between the tribal nations and the US government?
I think, and I don't want to speak for tribal nations, but I think, with every administration change, there is concern if sovereignty were to be challenged again at that level, what that might look like today. In the previous administration, we saw tribal land come out of the Bureau of Indian Affairs Federal Trust for the first time in generations. We know that natural resource regulations or fossil fuels extraction, that's always a driving force in that zeitgeist. So I think that question's very valid, and yeah.
And then we had a couple of questions related to GLIFWC. This one is wondering, why do some tribes elect not to be a part of GLIFWC?
That's a good question. So GLIFWC was formed. So as you start to see those Supreme Court cases, those cases, the tribes that signed on to that litigation are the tribes that make up the commission. So it's not something, as best I understand it today, GLIFWC isn't really something you can join. It's through that court understanding from the early 80s, incorporated who was a part of GLIFWC from that time. And more specifically, as the tribes created GLIFWC to have this platform to create these regulations, the Voight Task Force is really the body that helps drive those recommendations through tribal perspective. And it's just those signatories of that litigation.
That makes sense. And kind of a follow-up to that as well. Are there other organizations like GLIFWC around the country that represent different regions of tribes? And if so, do the different orgs collaborate on policy and projects?
Yes. So just over to the east a bit is a group called CORA, CORA. And I think they primarily deal with Lake Michigan fisheries. I think the Bay Mills Indian community in the far east of the UP is a dual member because they have some stake in that game. Out in Washington State, there are organizations. There's another organization near Lac du Flambeau called GLITC, GLITC, that has a similar I guess, I don't want to say a similar mission, but we work very closely with them on different initiatives. So collaborative is a good word. Just representing our, there's also the 1854 Treaty Authority, and they have 3 Grand Portage, Bois Forte, and Fond du Lac in their membership. So yeah.
And then another question about GLIFWC, wondering about your data analytics used to assist tribes with resource management. If you could speak a little bit about that.
I'll do my best. So the scientists in that world are enormously talented, and we assist them with their publications. For example, every 5 years we produce, oh my gosh, I have it right here. I'm such a good little employee. The fishery status update. This is produced every 5 years. And this is a joint fishery assessment of Wisconsin specifically. But in here, you'll see all kinds of information on the current status and their methodology and research. And, mark capturing is one way that we understand the populations of walleye specifically, and, how that intersects with hatchery work, or understanding if they're being, naturally reproducing, or, when the water hits 42 temperature, 42 degrees and they can finally spawn. It's highly technical. And again, run through that Indigenous lens. So I hope that's helpful.
And is this something that's available to the public? And
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I will say, in the kindest way possible, our website needs some love, but I stand by the content 100%. So if you ever wanted to order like every so often we publish a book called the Ojibwe Treaty Rights, and it does a really good job of breaking down those court cases and just some of the teachings, and you can order that for $3 on our website. And again, we have a lot of free resources, and most of our stuff is digital download, so you can access this pretty quick.
Wonderful. And this last question is curious about what your greatest challenge is in educating people about the treaty rights of Native Americans.
That's such a good question. I think, I've been at GLIFWC a year and a half, and I think, sometimes in Wisconsin, there's a law called Act 31 that requires teachers to, give the local tribal information. And I think one of the biggest challenges we see is not that teachers don't want to, or districts don't want to. It's just building that confidence to do it. And, sometimes I'll say, because, people don't want to say the wrong thing or offend anybody. And I totally get that, because misinformation is harmful too. But I think the willingness to just try and admit, I'm doing my best, is okay. And I generally think that doing nothing is worse than, maybe making a mistake here or there. So really trying to support people's confidence and competence to help teach that material. And, I think there's such a big gap in education. So, sometimes I'll say that my third graders ask the same questions as the kids at St. Scholastica. And it's not because nobody's not trying, they just really haven't had the opportunity to get that information somewhere. And, sometimes resources get outdated, and, there might be language that isn't widely accepted, or terms, as evolves as everything does. So, just asking can be really intimidating. I know, as, somebody striving to learn more about my own culture at all the times, or pronouncing new language, that can feel really embarrassing and intimidating. And it's like, well, shouldn't you know this? And it's like, well, tell me why I don't, right? Because I, like you, went to an all English immersion school. So I had to go to college to learn my own history. So that's some of the bigger challenges, and really just the the Western sort of romantic picture that we have of Native people, that, we're not educated or doctors, or, bringing people into the 21st century is really important, and respecting the art and authors and Indigenous knowledge around species and beings is part of the challenge too. Like I said, sometimes it's like, oh yeah, that's what the boundaries used to look like, right? And it's like, no, but how do you not? You just don't know what you don't know.
Well, just thank you so much, Jenny, for taking the time to share with us about all the good work that you're doing and GLIFWC is doing. Again, this was recorded, so you can go back and watch this on demand, and visit GLIFWC's website if you had questions that come up later or weren't answered, I will link to Jenny's email and the GLIFWC website, and feel free to reach out there. So just thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.